He left her for being too simple. Years later, dying and alone, she's the only one who walks through the door, with his daughters. Lucas Matthews had always been driven by one thing: the hunger to succeed. From the moment he stepped foot on campus at Stanford, he wasn't there to make friends or soak in the college experience, he was there to build a future. He spent his nights coding, pitching to investors in coffee shops, and teaching himself to be the man no one could ignore. Along the way, there was Emily Carter. She was never part of his plan, not in the traditional sense. She had no grand ambitions to dominate the tech world. She studied early childhood education and wanted to teach first grade in a small town. But she had a kindness in her that disarmed Lucas. While others chased titles and networking events, Emily offered him a kind of peace he didn't realize he craved. She believed in his ideas before they were worth a cent. She listened when no one else did. She fed him when he forgot to eat and sat with him in silence when he failed his first round of funding. For a while, their lives fit together like puzzle pieces, imperfect but somehow right. They shared a cramped studio apartment with flickering lights and thin walls. Their furniture came from secondhand stores and their meals were often just instant noodles or grilled cheese, but they were happy. Emily loved the way Lucas lit up when he talked about his vision. Lucas, in turn, was fascinated by the way Emily could calm any storm, whether it was a panicked child she was tutoring or a breakdown he didn't want to admit he was having. But as his project grew into something promising, Lucas began to change. Meetings ran longer, emails became more urgent, and suddenly, Emily's slow, thoughtful world seemed too quiet. She still left him notes in his laptop bag, still brought him dinner when he worked late, but he no longer looked up when she entered the room. He stopped sharing his fears with her. She began to feel like background noise in a life that was moving too fast for her to follow. One evening, after Lucas had secured a massive seed investment, they went out to celebrate. Emily wore a simple blue dress that he once said made her eyes look like sky just before a storm. But that night, he barely looked at her. He talked about expansion, future acquisitions, press coverage. She tried to smile, to match his energy, but something inside her sank. On the walk home, she finally said it. "You don't see me anymore." He didn't deny it. He just looked at her like she had become a stranger. A week later, he left. No dramatic farewell, no promises of someday. Just a quiet, clean break. She came home to an empty apartment, his keys on the table, and the echo of her own breathing. She cried for days. Not just because he left, but because she never expected him to leave without a fight. The silence was louder than any goodbye. Then came the nausea. The dizziness. She thought it was heartbreak until the test turned positive. Not one heartbeat. 2. She was pregnant with twins, and the father, the man who once said she was the calm to his storm, was gone, unreachable, building a world where she no longer existed. She didn't chase him. Not out of pride, but because she knew he had made his choice. And now, she had to make hers. Emily stood alone in her tiny kitchen, the faint hum of the refrigerator the only sound that filled the air as she read the test result again and again, as if the words might change. Pregnant. Twins. The reality hit her in quiet, heavy waves, not with panic or tears, but with a deep stillness that felt almost hollow. She sank slowly into a chair, placed her hands on her flat stomach, and closed her eyes. Lucas was gone. Not just physically, but completely unreachable, consumed by a world she no longer recognized. She hadn't heard from him since the day he left, and something told her she never would. The child, or now, children, growing inside her would never know the man she once loved, the man who used to hold her hand at midnight and whisper about changing the world. She could have tried to contact him, of course. One message, one phone call, and she could have broken the silence. But she didn't. Not out of anger, not even bitterness, but out of a quiet certainty that whatever they had was no longer there. He had walked away from their life without a backward glance, and she had no intention of begging him to come back into a life he had already deemed too small for his dreams. So she moved forward, slowly and alone. She started saving every penny, cutting back on everything, canceling her streaming subscriptions, eating only the cheapest groceries, and selling anything that wasn't essential. She picked up extra hours at the daycare where she worked and took evening babysitting jobs. Her feet ached constantly, her back began to hurt before the second trimester even started, and the loneliness, especially at night, was a weight she couldn't shake. But every time she felt one of the babies move inside her, a flutter like hope brushing against her ribs, she found the strength to keep going. The pregnancy was hard. Complications, swelling, exhaustion that ran so deep she sometimes forgot what it felt like to be rested. But she never allowed herself to fall apart. She talked to them every night. Told them stories. Promised them they would never feel like they were not enough. She didn't know how she would do it, 2 cribs, 2 sets of clothes, double the diapers, but she knew she would. When the time came, she went into labor alone, taking a cab to the hospital in the middle of the night, gripping her coat in silence as waves of pain made her breath hitch. No one was there to hold her hand. No one waited in the hallway with flowers. But when the nurse placed her daughters in her arms, both wrapped in identical blue hospital blankets, their dark brown hair already soft and thick, and their eyes, bright and startling blue, opened to meet hers, the world became quiet and whole again. She named them Ava and Grace. The first few months were a blur of feedings, sleepless nights, and a constant sense of being overwhelmed. She would stand in the tiny nursery at 3 a.m., one baby on her shoulder, the other crying in the crib, and whisper, "I've got you. I'm not going anywhere." She learned to live on 2 hours of sleep. She taught herself to cook with one hand and feed 2 babies at once. She accepted help only when she absolutely had to, never wanting to burden anyone. Her life was no longer her own, but she didn't mourn that. Every time one of the girls smiled or curled their fingers around hers, she remembered why she chose to stay silent, why she didn't call Lucas, why she never looked back. They grew quickly, side by side, mirror images of the man who had walked away. Sometimes, when she looked at them too long, it hurt. But even that pain became something she accepted, not as a wound, but as a scar she learned to live with. Lucas may have walked out on her, but she had found something so much deeper than the version of love he had offered. She had found purpose. She had found a fierce, quiet power in building a life from the pieces he left behind. And though the world didn't see her strength, and no magazine praised her determination, Emily knew something Lucas might never understand: true success wasn't measured in shares or wealth. It was in late-night lullabies, tiny socks, and the way 2 little girls reached for her with absolute trust. Lucas Matthews stood in his penthouse apartment, staring out over the city skyline that glittered beneath the early morning haze. The glass walls around him reflected back a man who should have felt invincible. He had everything he'd ever worked for: a billion-dollar tech company, global recognition, a team of advisors who followed his every word, and a revolving door of polished women who admired his power more than his soul. But that morning, the silence in his home was deafening. The leather furniture, the award plaques, the sleek kitchen untouched by anything other than catered meals, it all felt like a museum exhibit of someone else's life. He poured himself a black coffee, no sugar, no cream, and sat at the edge of the couch he never relaxed on. There had been no peace in his life for years, only momentum. His calendar was full, his phone never stopped buzzing, and his assistants made sure he never had to face discomfort for more than 5 minutes. But somewhere along the way, the fire that once burned with ambition had turned to something colder, something hollow. His victories felt muted. His celebrations were strategic. He couldn't remember the last time he had laughed, not a performative chuckle at a networking dinner, but real, unfiltered laughter. He scrolled through his contacts, pausing at names he hadn't called in years. He didn't know who he would even call if he got sick, if something went wrong. His parents had passed away within a year of each other, both of them proud of him but bewildered by the world he had chosen. He had no siblings. His childhood friends had faded as his success grew, not out of envy but out of incompatibility. He had become unreachable. Unrelatable. One night, at a charity gala filled with people who smiled too wide and asked the same questions in different ways, Lucas had excused himself early. He got into the back of his chauffeured car and told the driver to just drive. No destination. Just away. For an hour, he rode through neighborhoods he didn't recognize, watching families through glowing windows, children chasing each other in pajamas, couples walking dogs. He saw a woman pushing a stroller and felt something pull at him, a flicker of something he couldn't name. It wasn't longing. It was memory. He dreamed about Emily that night. She was laughing in that blue dress, the one she wore on their last night together, sitting barefoot on the couch of their old apartment, eating cereal at midnight. She wasn't saying anything in the dream. She was just there. And when he woke up, his chest felt heavy with something more suffocating than regret. It was the realization that he had walked away from the only part of his life that ever felt real. That same week, he noticed the pain. It started in his back, dull but persistent. Then came the weight loss. He dismissed it. He was tired, overworked. Stress. But his doctor didn't agree. Blood tests led to scans. Scans led to biopsies. And then came the diagnosis, dropped into his lap like a hammer wrapped in silk. Cancer. Rare. Aggressive. Suddenly, the empire he had built seemed meaningless. The meetings, the mergers, the reputation, it wouldn't hold his hand during chemo. It wouldn't comfort him at 3 a.m. in a cold hospital bed. He told almost no one. Only his COO and lawyer knew, and even they were instructed to keep it under wraps. He didn't want pity. He didn't want headlines. But most of all, he didn't want to admit how alone he truly was. As treatments began, the side effects arrived like thieves, quiet and cruel. The first time he vomited blood, he realized no one was coming. Not a friend. Not a partner. Not even a nurse who cared beyond protocol. He lay in a hospital bed one night, staring at the ceiling, the room buzzing with machines, and thought about Emily. He wondered where she was, what she was doing. Whether she had ever thought of him again. He didn't know that she had thought of him every day, not with love, but with the ache of unfinished stories. He had no idea that two little girls, both with his eyes and his stubborn chin, existed just a few miles away, whispering their hopes to a mother who had never once spoken his name with hatred. Lucas closed his eyes, the pain in his bones rising like a tide, and whispered a name into the dark. Not the name of a company, not a brand, not a product. Just her name. Emily. He didn't know what he expected, certainly not forgiveness. But he also knew, for the first time, that if he had one last chance to make anything right before he left this world, it would begin and end with her. Emily had never truly stopped wondering if Lucas thought about them, about her, about the daughters he never knew, about the version of life they might have had if he hadn't chosen ambition over everything else. But she never expected to hear from him again, and certainly not the way she did. It came in the form of a plain envelope, no return address, slid quietly into her mailbox on a Wednesday afternoon. She almost didn't open it, thinking it was another piece of junk mail. But when she finally unfolded the single sheet of paper, her breath caught in her throat. The handwriting was unmistakably his. Clean, precise, the same style he used to scrawl notes on napkins when inspiration struck over midnight coffee. There were only a few lines. No apologies. No explanations. Just a message that said he was sick and didn't know who else to reach out to. He didn't ask for anything. He didn't beg. He just said he was alone. And then, below the signature, an address. A hospital. She sat with the letter in her lap for hours after the girls had gone to sleep, her thoughts a tangled mess of memory and instinct. Part of her wanted to throw it away. He had left without a second thought, had abandoned her at the most vulnerable moment in her life, and now, what? He expected her to show up and hold his hand? But there was another part of her, one that had never completely hardened, one shaped by the years of raising two little girls who carried his face and his energy and his stubbornness. That part of her knew she had to go. Not for him. But for herself. For closure. For clarity. For something she couldn't yet name but knew was waiting at the end of that hospital hallway. The next morning, she woke up before dawn, packed a small bag with snacks and picture books, dressed Ava and Grace in matching sweaters and jeans, and told them they were going to visit someone very important. The girls were curious, asking questions in their usual rapid-fire chatter, but she gave them only what she thought they could carry. He was someone she used to know, someone who might need a little kindness. They didn't press further. They never had a grandfather or a father figure, so the idea of meeting someone new didn't carry the same emotional weight. For them, it was just a day out with their mom, and that was enough. When they reached the hospital, Emily's hands were trembling. She hadn't seen Lucas in over 5 years. She didn't know what he looked like now, what his voice sounded like, or what his eyes would say when they landed on her again. But when the nurse opened the door to his room and she stepped inside, everything stilled. He was there, sitting up against a pile of pillows, a blanket over his legs, pale but alert. The sharpness in his face had softened, his features hollowed slightly by illness, but his eyes were the same, deep, searching, still full of something unspoken. He didn't speak at first. He just looked at her, then at the girls. And in that moment, he didn't need to ask. He knew. The resemblance was undeniable. Two small faces that mirrored his own, down to the shape of their noses and the tilt of their chins. Ava clung to Emily's leg, shy but observant. Grace walked right up to the bed, fearless as always, and said, "Are you the man from Mama's letter?" Lucas blinked hard, then nodded, not trusting his voice. Emily stood there, arms crossed, unsure what she expected to feel, rage, grief, maybe even pity, but what came instead was something quieter. Sadness. Not for herself, but for him. He was so clearly alone, surrounded by machines and charts and a room that smelled like antiseptic and loss. She could have turned around. She could have walked away. But instead, she pulled a chair closer to the bed and sat down, her girls climbing into her lap. Lucas cleared his throat, finally managing to whisper, "You came." She didn't respond immediately. She just looked at him for a long time, her voice steady when she finally said, "We didn't come for revenge. We came for forgiveness." In that sterile hospital room, where nothing had changed except everything, something began to break open between them. Not like a wound reopening, but like a door that had been shut too long. And behind that door wasn't anger or blame, it was pain, yes, but also the possibility of healing. Lucas watched the girls as they talked to him about school and favorite colors and how Grace always tried to eat more ice cream than Ava. He laughed once, unexpectedly, and it startled even him. Emily smiled, just faintly, and for the first time in years, it felt real. They stayed for an hour. Then another. Lucas fell asleep near the end, exhausted but smiling. As Emily tucked the blanket around him and gathered the girls, she paused at the door. She didn't say goodbye. She said, "We'll be back tomorrow." And she meant it. Not because he deserved it. But because compassion wasn't about who earned it, it was about who needed it most. Emily didn't know what she expected after that first visit, but something shifted in her after walking out of the hospital. She had arrived there carrying years of silence, hurt, and questions, but she left with something unexpected, a strange lightness, not quite peace but something close to it. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, and certainly not forgetting. But it was a release from the weight she had carried alone since the day Lucas walked out. She found herself driving back the next day with less hesitation, the girls chattering in the back seat, full of stories they had saved just for him. Grace insisted on bringing him one of her drawings, and Ava carried a book she wanted to read aloud. Emily hadn't told them much, but somehow the girls seemed to understand that this man mattered in a way they couldn't name. When they arrived at his hospital room, Lucas was sitting up again, looking a little stronger than the day before. The look on his face when the girls entered was something Emily hadn't seen on him in years, pure, unfiltered emotion. He didn't try to mask it with charm or confidence. He looked at them like he was memorizing their faces, afraid they might disappear if he blinked too long. Grace ran to him without hesitation, holding up her drawing, a messy but colorful picture of 3 stick figures with matching brown hair and blue eyes. "This is you, and Mommy, and me and Ava," she announced proudly. Lucas took the paper like it was a priceless artifact. He didn't speak, just nodded, swallowing hard as he blinked away the tears. Ava was more cautious. She climbed into a chair near the bed and opened her book, glancing up at him with quiet curiosity. "Do you want to hear a story?" she asked. Lucas nodded again, his voice still weak. "Very much." And so she began to read, her small voice filling the sterile room with warmth. Emily sat silently in the corner, watching. She still didn't know how she felt. She had come back out of compassion, not hope, and certainly not for the chance to rebuild anything. But watching Lucas with the girls, watching how gently he responded, how intently he listened, she couldn't deny something painful and beautiful was unraveling between all of them. Over the next few weeks, the visits became a rhythm. They came every afternoon after school. Emily packed snacks, coloring books, and puzzles. Lucas would sit with the girls as long as he could stay awake, then listen to them talk while he rested. The girls quickly formed their own relationship with him, unburdened by the past. They didn't care about mistakes or history. They just knew he smiled when they entered the room and always asked to hear more about their day. Emily stayed guarded, never letting her emotions show too much. She didn't want him to misinterpret her presence as reconciliation. She was there for the girls, and, if she was honest, for the part of herself that still remembered the man he once was before ambition turned him cold. But Lucas was changing. The illness had stripped away the layers of ego and control he once wore like armor. In its place was someone raw and honest, someone who didn't pretend anymore. He started to talk to Emily, slowly, carefully. He asked questions he had never bothered with before, how she had managed after he left, what the pregnancy had been like, what the girls were like as babies. Emily answered when she could, but some things she still kept close. It wasn't easy for her to relive those memories, and some nights she would lie awake wondering why she was letting him back into their lives, even in this limited way. One afternoon, while the girls were drawing on the floor, Lucas turned to Emily and said quietly, "I didn't leave because I didn't love you. I left because I was afraid I wouldn't know how to be enough for you and still be who I thought I had to become." She didn't look at him right away. She watched the girls coloring, their small bodies curled over paper, lost in their own world. "You weren't supposed to be perfect," she said eventually. "You were just supposed to stay." He nodded slowly. "I know that now." It wasn't an apology. Not really. But it was the first time he had admitted fear, the first time he had stripped away the arrogance that once defined him. Emily didn't answer. She didn't need to. They both knew the conversation wasn't about the past anymore. It was about what little future they still had. As the days passed, the prognosis remained uncertain. Lucas had good days and bad days, moments of energy and long stretches of fatigue. The girls began calling him Daddy without anyone telling them to. It happened naturally, like they had always known. Emily never corrected them. Lucas never asked her to. And though she still held pieces of herself close, still guarded the most fragile parts of her heart, she started to wonder, quietly, secretly, if some broken things could still bloom again, even in the shadow of what had once seemed like the end. Lucas had begun to understand just how much of life he had missed while chasing a version of success that no longer seemed to matter. The sterile halls of the hospital had become something else over the last few weeks, a sanctuary of sorts, not because they were comforting, but because they had forced him to confront everything he'd spent years avoiding. The daily presence of Emily and the girls became the only part of his day that gave him purpose. In a world that once worshipped him for his power and influence, it was two small children and a woman he had once walked away from who brought him back to life in pieces. The nurses started to notice the change. Lucas had been a difficult patient before, cold and distant, refusing help unless absolutely necessary. Now, he smiled more often. He asked questions. He even laughed, quietly, when the girls made up songs about the beeping monitors or called the four-pole robot spaghetti. Emily would sit by the window with her coffee, watching as the girls curled up beside their father, oblivious to the machines, the tiredness behind his eyes, or the weight he carried in silence. She had begun to notice how he looked at them when he thought she wasn't watching, like every second was something he needed to memorize. One evening, when the room was quiet and the girls had fallen asleep on the small sofa by the wall, Lucas asked Emily if she remembered their first apartment, the one with the leaky faucet and the crooked bookshelf he had promised to fix but never did. She smiled faintly, not at the memory of the place itself, but at the warmth it carried, the sense that they were two people trying to build something real, even if the foundation hadn't been strong enough at the time. He told her he still remembered the way she used to sing while cooking, sometimes off-key, always loud. He said he missed the sound of her voice more than anything after he left. Emily didn't respond right away. The room held the kind of silence that only people with shared history can sit inside without discomfort. Eventually, she spoke, not out of bitterness but honesty. She told him how alone she had felt in the delivery room, how terrifying it was to bring two lives into the world without the person who had helped create them. She told him how Ava had been born crying but Grace had arrived in silence, and for a moment, the doctors thought something was wrong. But then Grace had opened her eyes, those same intense brown eyes that stared straight through people like they were windows, and Emily knew she would be just fine. Lucas listened without interruption. For the first time in his life, he wasn't trying to fix anything. He was just present, absorbing the story he hadn't been brave enough to live through. When Emily finished, she looked at him and said, "You missed a lot, Lucas." He nodded, voice thick. "I know. And I'll never be able to give those years back to you, or to them. But if you'll let me, I want to make something of what's left." His words weren't promises. They weren't grand gestures. But they were grounded in something she hadn't seen in him before, humility. That night, before she left with the girls, Emily tucked the blanket around his legs and paused. She leaned down and kissed his forehead gently, something she hadn't done in nearly 6 years. He closed his eyes, holding on to the warmth of that simple gesture longer than he held on to any business deal or award he'd ever received. Back at home, the girls started drawing pictures of the hospital room, always including a version of their father in the bed and themselves sitting beside him. Emily kept every one, taping them onto the fridge, watching the way they colored him with soft smiles and open eyes. There was no bitterness in their art, only love, the kind that didn't ask questions or count years lost. Lucas began to write letters in his journal, one for each girl, one for Emily. He didn't tell anyone. It wasn't for the sake of closure, but a way to hold on to everything he was just beginning to understand. In those pages, he poured out what he never had the words to say aloud. He wrote about how he had always thought strength meant not needing anyone, and how wrong that belief had been. He wrote about the moment he first saw Ava read to him, how her voice filled the room with calm, and the way Grace's hand felt when she slipped it into his without hesitation. And he wrote to Emily about the quiet courage it must have taken to show up again, not for him, but for their children, and maybe, just a little, for herself. The illness still moved through him, unpredictable and cruel, but he no longer met each day with dread. There was something to look forward to now. Even if his future was uncertain, the present finally felt worth holding on to. Lucas began to measure time differently. It was no longer tracked by meetings, flights, or quarterly reports. Now it was measured by the sound of his daughter's laughter echoing in the sterile hospital room, by how long he could stay awake while Ava read to him, or by how many puzzles he could finish with Grace before fatigue took over. Each moment became its own world, and he held them carefully, like glass, fragile, precious, fleeting. He had once lived on the edge of a calendar so tightly packed he barely had time to breathe, but now time stretched differently. Sometimes an hour felt like a lifetime. Sometimes an entire day passed in the blink of an eye, especially when the girls were there. Emily noticed the changes in him more than anyone. At first, she watched skeptically, unsure if what she was seeing was real or just a performance. But Lucas no longer seemed to care about appearances. He spoke openly, even about his regrets, and never tried to justify his choices. Instead, he asked questions he used to avoid. He wanted to know everything: the girls' favorite songs, what made them cry, who their best friends were at school, what foods they refused to eat even after being bribed. He remembered the little things she said. He asked again when he forgot. He was present in a way that stunned her. One morning, after a particularly long night where Lucas had struggled with nausea and couldn't sleep, Emily arrived to find him holding one of the letters he'd been writing. He handed it to her without a word. She sat beside him and read it while he rested his eyes. The letter wasn't poetic. It didn't try to romanticize the past or beg for forgiveness. It simply told the story of a man who had chosen ambition over love, and how that choice had cost him years of something he could never get back. He thanked her, not just for showing up, but for not poisoning the girls with resentment, for allowing them to see him not as a mistake but as a possibility. By the time she finished, there were tears on her cheeks, silent and slow. She didn't speak. She just reached out and took his hand. He squeezed it, weakly, and for the first time in a long time, there was nothing left unsaid between them. That day, Emily brought photo albums. Not just of the girls, but of her life without him. Birthdays, school performances, Halloween costumes, messy first drawings. She flipped through them with Lucas, pointing out the tiny details: the tooth Ava lost too early, the way Grace always tried to smile with her whole face. Lucas studied each picture like it was a clue to a mystery he'd been too blind to solve for years. The girls arrived later, full of energy and stories about a school art contest. Grace had won third place. Ava had helped another classmate and was given a kindness certificate. Lucas lit up at every detail. He asked to see the drawings and held the crumpled paper like it belonged in a museum. When Grace climbed into bed beside him and placed a toy in his hand, her favorite stuffed fox, he almost broke. "You can borrow him tonight," she whispered. "He helps me sleep when I have bad dreams." Lucas didn't trust his voice enough to answer, so he simply nodded, clutching the soft toy with shaking fingers. That evening, after the girls had gone and Emily stayed behind, Lucas asked her something he hadn't dared say aloud. "Do you think they'll remember me well?" It wasn't self-pity, not anymore. It was the honest question of a father trying to make peace with the limits of time. Emily looked at him, her eyes both tired and full. "They'll remember your eyes when you smiled," she said. "They'll remember your voice when you read to them. They'll remember how you showed up when it mattered most. And if they forget the beginning, I'll remind them who you became in the end." Lucas turned his head away, but not fast enough to hide the tears that filled his eyes. In all his years of building empires, making headlines, and becoming someone the world admired, he had never been more moved than in that moment. He had once believed legacy came from impact, from power, from lasting influence. But now he understood legacy was something far quieter. It was a whispered bedtime story. A hand held through pain. A child's toy offered freely. A woman who stayed, not because she had to, but because her heart still carried the capacity to forgive. That night, Emily stayed late. They didn't talk much. They didn't need to. Lucas drifted in and out of sleep, and she sat there, quietly watching over him the way he had never done for her when she needed it most. And still, she stayed. Not to settle a score. Not to rewrite the past. But to be there in the moments that still mattered. Because sometimes, the most powerful kind of love isn't the one that never breaks. It's the one that breaks, and comes back softer, braver, and still willing. Lucas's health began to decline more noticeably in the final weeks of spring. There was a change in the rhythm of things. He tired more easily, his voice grew softer, and his hands trembled when he tried to hold a pen or reach for a cup. The hospital room, once filled with quiet chatter, drawings, and the sounds of small footsteps, began to feel slower, quieter, as if time was beginning to prepare everyone for goodbye. But even as his strength faded, something else grew stronger in its place, a kind of peace that came only after everything had been stripped away. He no longer fought the illness or the truth of his mistakes. Instead, he focused on what still remained. One morning, Emily arrived to find him propped up in bed, looking pale but alert. His eyes searched for hers the moment she walked in. He smiled, and despite the weakness in his body, his face lit up in a way that made her chest tighten. She set her things down and moved closer, sitting beside him, her hand finding his without hesitation. "I was hoping you'd come early," he said, his voice raspy but clear. "There's something I want to do before the girls get here." From the bedside drawer, he pulled out a small, worn envelope. Inside were the letters he'd written, folded neatly and labeled with each of their names, Ava, Grace, and Emily. He handed them to her with care, as if they might crumble if held too tightly. "I didn't write them because I expect anything," he said. "I wrote them because they deserve to know, in my own words, how much they changed me. And you deserve more than silence." Emily held the envelope close to her chest, nodding once, unable to speak as the weight of it sank in. He closed his eyes for a moment, then opened them again. "You saved me, Emily. Not just by being here now. But by showing me that love isn't about who wins or who leaves. It's about who shows up when it's hardest." Later that afternoon, the girls arrived with paper crowns on their heads and a handful of wildflowers they'd picked from a park on the way. They jumped onto the bed with practiced ease, curling up next to him, telling him about their day as though he wasn't hooked up to machines, as though nothing had changed. Ava placed one of the crowns on his head and clapped her hands. "Now you're the king," she declared proudly. Grace nodded solemnly. "The kind king. Not the bossy kind like in books." Lucas chuckled, and the sound filled the room with something light, something free. Emily stood back, watching her daughters with the man they had learned to love not because he was perfect but because he had tried, because he had let them in and never asked them to carry the weight of his regrets. In those moments, the past didn't matter. The future was unknown. But the present, this moment, was enough. As the sun dipped below the horizon that evening, casting golden light through the hospital window, Lucas asked Emily to bring the girls close. He took their small hands in his and looked at them, his eyes full of emotion. "You are my heart," he said softly. "Both of you. I want you to grow up knowing how proud I am of you, every single day. You've made me brave." Ava laid her head on his shoulder, and Grace squeezed his hand. Emily moved closer, sitting on the other side of the bed. He reached out for her, and she let him. They stayed that way for a long time, a quiet tangle of warmth and closeness, surrounded by the hum of monitors and the faint scent of flowers. No one cried. There was nothing tragic in that moment. Only love, pure and unfiltered. In the days that followed, Lucas drifted more often, sleeping longer, speaking less. But he was never alone. Emily and the girls remained by his side, reading, talking, simply being there. When the time finally came, it wasn't with fear. He slipped away gently, his last breath taken with Emily's hand in his and the girls resting beside him, wrapped in blankets and love. There were no dramatic goodbyes, only the quiet promise that he would live on in stories, in drawings, in whispered memories passed between mother and daughters. After the funeral, Emily took the girls to the beach, the same place she had once gone alone to think, to cry, to survive. This time, they brought Lucas's letters with them. She read each one aloud as the girls listened, eyes wide and curious, holding hands against the breeze. His words were filled with sorrow, yes, but also hope. He wrote about courage, about second chances, about how sometimes the best things in life come after everything has broken. He told them to be kind, to be fierce, to love without fear. Emily looked out at the sea, the wind in her hair, the sound of her daughters laughing as they chased waves, and she felt something new inside her. Not closure. Not quite. But peace. The kind that comes not from forgetting, but from knowing you gave everything you had. She had loved and been hurt. She had raised her girls with grace. And in the end, she had forgiven a man who never thought he was worthy of it. And in doing so, she had shown her daughters what love truly meant.